Hey, Reading Lenz listener, Jason Banzoff here, producer for the Group Talk network of podcasts. I want to talk to you about a few things before we kick off this episode. We're going to be ending 2022 with some great Reading Lenz episodes. And then in 2023, we got a treat for you. Reading Lenz will become the Group Takeaways with Nick Lenzi. Nick has some great things lined up, so make sure you keep an eye out for the great things coming out in 2023. We can't wait to put these out. So until then, enjoy this Reading Lenz classic. Welcome to Group Talk. 4 shows, 1 podcast from the Small Group Network focusing on topics relevant to small group ministries. Whether you're in a church of 100 or 10,000, whether you're a volunteer or staff, we want to support, encourage, and equip you to lead well. So relax, listen, and enjoy Reading Lenz with Nick Lenzi.
Hey, Small Group Network, welcome back to another episode of Reading Lenz. We're so glad you chose to take time to hang out with us. Here is how Reading Lenz works. Each month, I have a guest with us who is also a small group point person to share with you insights from books we are reading and what our takeaways were and how we plan to incorporate them into our lives, leadership, or our small groups. Today's guest is a personal favorite of mine to geek out with about small groups, Alan White. Welcome to Reading Lenz, Alan.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Alan has been in the groups world for over 30 years, which is so impressive, like your commitment. If I'm being honest, I think about quitting probably once a month. But what I love about Alan is he's one of my go-to guys when I get stuck. He writes an informative and relevant newsletter / blog that comes out on Tuesdays. So I always look forward to that email coming in. Usually on my walk home is when I will dive into that. And then he also has a new podcast out, the Exponential Groups podcast. And I would say new, but you have 7 episodes already. So that's
I do.
Impressive.
I've and everybody quits at 7. So we'll see if I have another episode.
Well, I'm sure we'll do a trade here, so I'm sure I'll be on it sometime soon. So
I'd love that.
That'll at least make 8. I know you had Carolyn on in your most recent one, so we're excited that you got to interview her because usually she's the one interviewing.
Carolyn's awesome. She knows so much and she's so humble about it. It's just amazing.
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. So, and you've also authored, this is just according to Amazon, but you've authored 5 small group books. Do you have more than 5, I'm guessing?
I might have 6 with my name on them, but I write a lot of other books that have other people's names on them, but I won't tell you who.
I really appreciate how much of a connector you are. You have a real appreciation for those who've come before you. So I know that you're super close with Carl George, and after 30 years, you're still learning. And I think that's just a great model for all of us to just not give up and continue learning. And I think that's huge.
Yeah. And Carl's been such a gift. Unfortunately, I moved, so I'm not across town from him anymore. So it's a little harder to get to lunch. But one of the things I've learned is I can't show off, all of my stuff that I know in front of Carl, because he loves me enough. He'll put me right in my place. And it's good to have people like that in your life.
That's a great friend. Yeah. So, hey, and one other thing I should disclose, you guys, Alan is a former coach of mine. And I promise you, he's not paying for me to say this, but he was so helpful at helping us walk through our church's first church-wide groups campaign. And I really enjoyed what I loved. It was not just getting one-on-ones with Alan, which were fantastic, but also there's a monthly call group that went with it. So I'm a big fan of learning from others, as you can already tell from this show. But what got you into the coaching side of it?
I had a coach. And our groups were stuck. We had about 30% of our adults in groups, and I joined a coaching group. It was kind of crazy. It was a conference call. It had 40 pastors from across the country. There was this guy in there that talked all the time. His name was Alan White. He was so annoying. But within 3 weeks, I doubled my groups. So then I went into actually helping them with the groups. And then I went into coaching other pastors myself. And then I went into running the whole thing. And then a few years ago, switched over and started doing my own deal. But I saw the value of it, of not just reading the book, not just going to the conference, which all those things have value, but being with a cohort of people that are doing some of the same things, that are suffering the same ups and downs that you are, and can encourage each other and learn from each other. And I've had, great satisfaction in being able to coach churches further than what I was able to accomplish. And I mean, our groups, we got to 125% in groups, but I've seen people have twice as many in groups as in the weekend service. So, and that's not just because of me, it's just creating that environment. And I have the spiritual gift of stirring it up. Yeah. And so I just kind of, help people. I challenge their assumptions and the way that they've been doing it. And, everybody wants better results. Everybody wants new things, but nobody wants to change because we're afraid, because we change, means we're going to lose something. And so I try to reassure people that, hey, you can gently let go of this other thing that you're holding on to that's not getting you any results, and you can jump into other stuff. Of course, you were a very good student. Didn't have to pry your hands off of your old way of doing things. You were ready to go.
I appreciate that. Cool. So, hey, let's dive into today's book. I mean, just you talking about some of the coaching stuff, I can just see some of the principles from this book, and that not needing to be a hero, but being a guide. But for those who are new to our show, I love having our guests choose the book. And so Alan, when I reached out to him, was bold enough not just to pick one, but pick 2 books for us this month. But why don't you share with the audience which books you went with and why?
Well, one time I was sitting in church and our pastor said, some people's lives are like half-read books. And my wife elbowed me and said, your life is half-read books. Because I'm always in like at least a half a dozen books at a time. And I used to feel so guilty that I wouldn't finish books. And then I realized if they'd written better books, I would have finished them. So I was reading several books at a time, and I was reading 2 at the same time that I thought had nothing to do with each other. One was Storybrand by Donald Miller, and the other was Hero Maker by Dave Ferguson and Dr. Warren Bird. And the more I read both of them, the more I realized they had everything to do with each other. And I was reading it for different reasons. Storybrand I was reading because, I have products and services, and I want to. But the other thing about kind of sales, marketing kinds of books, they teach you a lot about human nature.
Yes.
And then, of course, Hero Maker is about multiplying in the church and, multiplying yourself, developing leaders. And the more I read them, they kind of fell on the same theme. And the theme was that I'm not the hero in the story, and you're not the hero in the story. And your senior pastor is not the hero in the story. And your worship leader is not the hero in the story. And he can go cry about that. But we're not the hero. We're at the best, we're the guide, but we're not the hero.
Yeah. For those who might be wondering, is it that Donald Miller? Yeah, it's the same Blue Like Jazz. Donald Miller has really taken a pivot, and he has moved more into business and marketing. But I actually think it's a good thing.
Yeah. I think the bottom line was he got tired of writing memoirs about himself.
Yes. I think that gets extremely difficult.
Which, after a while, a person only does so many interesting things in their life, and then they just have to start making stuff up. So, so he actually went and began to look at this idea of story for the purposes of marketing and acquiring customers, and how does story relate to that? And so he took this story framework, and we see this all the time in advertising.
Yeah.
I mean, think about all of those annoying pharmaceutical commercials that we watch, right? So you watch these commercials, and what do? They tell a story. They tell a story of somebody who wants to live a better life, but they have a medical problem, and their medical problem is keeping them from living the better life. But then their doctor recommends, if you take this medication, then you'll be able to live the life you want. But if you don't take this medication, you're going to get sick and die. And then they have all of these, weird names. Like when I saw a commercial for a medication called Skyrizi, I thought, they've officially run out of decent names for prescription medication. Skyrizi, come on. And I don't even know what it does. I just know that it's annoying. And if my doctor ever says I should have it, I'm going to say, nope, I'm taking nothing that's named that.
I'm sure they used like a spin wheel on that one. They just spun it, and Sky came up. All right, let's see what the next one is. Rizzy. Oh, no.
But the idea is that you're living a story. You're living your own story. And for most of us, it's like we get up in the morning and we get ourselves together. We get our kids off to school, and we go to work, and we go through our day. We come home in the evening. We get our kids ready for bed, and then we get up the next day and do it all again. It doesn't seem like a very exciting story. But that's okay, because if it gets too exciting, then we get all stressed out. But everybody has a story. Everybody has something that they're facing, something that they want to accomplish, and then they have something that's getting in the way of accomplishing what they want to accomplish. This is why weight loss programs, there'll always be a new one, and they'll always be in business because there are obstacles there. And so people have a story, they have something they want to accomplish. So the question is, when we look at what we do in the church, we know all of the reasons that we do small groups. We know all of the reasons we want to recruit leaders. We know all the reasons we do the weekend service. But have we stopped to consider the people that we're reaching, the people that are in our congregations? what's their story and how is what we're doing connect to their story? And I think that begins to reveal some of the frustration of we advertise things, we talk about things, we harangue people, we bribe them, we do all of these things to get them involved, and then they still don't get involved. And we think, well, they're not listening, or they're not committed, or, whatever else. And the reality is we haven't come up with something that's going to help them solve the problem that they're facing.
Yeah.
So I think we really have to start with what is the problem that we're facing and how can the church do something about meeting their need?
Yeah.
And instead of everybody needs to get on the same program, well, people are just not the same.
Yeah, that's so good. You saying that just makes me think too. This is a common theme that's been happening in the last several episodes of this podcast has been a lot of this. We want something for people, not from them. And I think that's one of the other things that this Storybrand formula is really trying to help with is that so often the way that we don't intentionally mean to do this, but the way in which we try to get people into a community or into a group or into church, whatever it may be, I think sometimes turns into like, the way we communicate it is like, oh, that church just wants something from me. Like they just want me to be at this group. They don't actually we're not doing a great job of communicating what's in it for them. So why don't we stop for a second and I'll walk through the Storybrand formula.
Okay.
These are the chapters that they have, and it's literally the formula. So it's a character has a problem and meets a guide who gives them a plan and calls them to action that helps them avoid a failure and ends in success. So Alan and I are going to walk through like each one of these and how they look into group. Why don't we start with the basic one? Who's our character, Alan?
So your character could be and by the way, I use this formula when my 8-year-old wants me to tell him a story.
Nice.
And I'll say, well, who's the hero? Which is often him. What's the hero trying to accomplish? What's getting in the hero's way? And then he'll put all the pieces, and then we'll actually I'll just tell the story based on, all the points that he's given.
I can't wait to steal that.
and the other thing, it totally works.
Yeah.
And then of course it always has to be a happy ending.
Yeah.
We even know from movies, if it's a happy ending, it's going to be a bestseller.
Yeah.
If it's not a happy ending, it's going to be critically acclaimed.
Yes.
It won't be a happy ending. So we can start with the hero of the story is the average person in our church.
So our character is the group member. So what is the problem that a group member had? And I'm actually I'll leave this story to you to tell, but you were talking about how your son has found community in a place that you kind of didn't expect. And would you mind sharing that story with us?
Yeah. My oldest, he finds community in, a text group. And then my 16-year-old finds community on, with Minecraft and Fortnite. And on Twitch and, and my daughter finds community with FaceTime and Instagram and all of that. My little boy, he does a lot with FaceTime. In fact, he was on with his friend from Greenville for 2 hours yesterday.
Wow.
But they'll play games together. They'll play Battleship together over FaceTime. So the pandemic didn't really stop anybody from connecting. But it's like, where do they find community? And so the difficulty was we can't meet in person because, last year there was a pandemic. We were supposed to stay apart. This year, the problem is they've all moved 1,000 miles literally from their friends, and yet they could stay connected with. So I guess that makes I'm the villain in the story because I moved them. And I want to be the guide, but now I'm the villain. Maybe my wife could be the guide. So how do you overcome that? Well, then they've overcome it with technology.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that jumped out to me in that article that you shared too is, and it's in your book, Exponential Groups, is everyone already has a group, right? So the problem can't be that they don't have a group or don't have a community. So what is that problem? Personally, I think it was interesting. I was in my small group huddle with our North Jersey group a couple weeks ago, and we were celebrating the success of another church that had started to develop a young adults group. And our church is a young adults group. We're like 90% young adults at our church. And it's interesting. I used to think that our success was related to, and this is definitely part of our success. It's a transient community. People have moved from all over the country to be here, and therefore they've left their family, and this is their family that they find, right? And this awesome leader in our huddle, she was talking about how she started the group by gathering them together and just listening to them and how much that helped. And the next week she was like, hey, could you invite your friends and we'll grab pizza and all this stuff? And their groups doubled. And we were just celebrating that. One of the things that really just stood out to that is that I actually think one of the things that those young adults are looking for, and I'm sure this is with everyone, is they finally had a place where they could have meaningful conversations, right? A place where they could be heard, and not just that. This is one of those things I think that social media has us so confused with what conversations look like, because I think we're just all throwing out points, but no one's really listening. And I feel like they also don't feel heard or understood. And there was actually a really good quote in the book. Let me see if I can find this quote. Oprah Winfrey, an undeniably successful guide to millions, once explained, the three things that every human being wants most are to be seen, heard, and understood. And in this essence of empathy. And I think that's just one of those things that that's where groups kind of find their success, is around being seen, heard, and understood.
Yeah. And I would say even in that, and I think those are great points, but we shouldn't take our cues from Oprah.
Yeah. Exactly.
We should sit down with people that have been resistant to joining a group and say, hey, what's your problem? No, we sit down with them and basically create a focus group and say, tell me about how our church can help you. I mean, I like that. And I think Dave Ferguson talks about this in his book, or I heard him say it somewhere, or I made it up. But it's almost like we need the old Home Depot motto. Remember the old Home Depot motto? You can do it. We can help.
Yeah.
You can do it. We can help. We're not going to do it for you. We're not going to provide everything for you. We're going to believe enough in you that you can do it and we can help. And then this goes to, again, the Storybrand book being a marketing book. One of the quotes, actually principle 3 from the book is, customers aren't looking for another hero. They're looking for a guide. Mm-hmm. So the pastor can't be the hero. The church can't be the hero. It's a matter of what is that individual trying to accomplish? Yeah. And then our role as pastors. And so jumping back to Dave Ferguson's book, he asks, how many people am I investing in? How many people am I mentoring to be commissioned to do great things? How many people am I taking through the hero making process? Yeah. And he has his own definition of what a hero making process is. But I mean, you look at even in the ministry of Jesus, and this is one of the things they bring out in the Hero Maker book, Jesus spent 73% of his time with his disciples. And because of the time he invested with those 12, you and I are talking today about church stuff. Yeah. The church exists in the world because of those 12. Jesus could have had a mega church if he wanted to. He fed the 5,000 plus women and children. He could have had the first ever mega church. He chose not to do that. He chose to invest, and I have nothing against mega churches. No, that's not your point. But the issue is 96% of churches are either declining or plateaued. And that also goes to Ferguson's book. And churches that are growing are not necessarily growing because people are coming to Christ. They're growing because people are coming to their church. So as much as we bemoan what's going on during the pandemic is, across North America, pastors that I talk to, in-person worship is down. Giving is steady or even up in some quarters. And salvations and baptisms are up. And what are we focused on? How can we get people back to church for the weekend service? Yeah. And it's like, wait a minute. If we're doing a better job of fulfilling the Great Commission and our weekend service is half of what it used to be, what exactly is the problem? And let's focus on discipling these people that are coming to Christ. They're watching online, and how do we give them next steps? Anyway, that's my soapbox. I'll get off of it. We'll go back to the regular programming.
No, I think that was great. This one's actually, I think, a fairly easy step, especially with the guide, and it's just as simple as just defining it as let us help, right? Yeah. I think this is especially true. I've found this so helpful at recruiting leaders, right? That they're scared that they have to take on too much. And for me to come in and say, look, I just need you to encourage your group to support each other in their own spiritual growth. And my job is going to be to partner with you in this. And here's how I'm going to partner with you, and being able to explain that out. I think it's just one of the things that just really kind of opened up the door to letting people know, all right, I'm not going to be alone on this. I'm going to have someone that's with me in this journey. Yeah. And I think that, especially if you have a church where I see this a lot, if I ever get a leader that has led in another church, sometimes they're worried they're just going to get abandoned. And it's just, here's your curriculum, go, see ya. I'll see you in 6 months kind of thing. And you kind of set it off. So I think that's the big part, which I think probably then leads into the next one, which is give them a plan. So do you know, like, I think it's helping them understand, all right, here, what are the steps and what can they expect? And so, like, I don't think we have time on today's podcast to get into a ton of like plan necessarily action on that. But once you have that plan, what are you going to be calling them to? So calls to action. And I think one of the things that's super important that this book really hammers home, and something that is a big mistake I used to make, and something that I'm constantly trying to think of, is what do you want your call to action to be? And it needs to be direct in one step. It can't be like multiple things that you want them to do. So it's like, do you want them to just learn more? Do you want them to sign up? Do you want them to inquire for more information? Those kind of things. So
yeah.
Anything that you would say about call to action that you've learned?
Yeah. And I think if you look in terms of, small group leaders or hosts or something you do with an alignment series, my first call to action for them is start a group, gather your friends and so start a group. But then my next call to action is continue your group. And then my next call to action is come to training. But it's that idea of just guiding them a step at a time and not giving them too much information. And, a lot of times in our communication in churches, we have a lot of things to offer. And I served a church of 6,500 and it had a lot of things to offer. And it prided itself in being complicated church and not being simple church.
Yeah.
But they would give equal time to things that involved half the congregation and things that involved 10 people in the congregation, which didn't make any sense. But they thought, well, we got to give our people lots of options and lots of things to choose from. But the more things they gave people to choose from, the less people made a decision. Because one of the statements Donald Miller uses a lot is, if you confuse, you lose.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you say, somebody says, you can start, they're like, okay, where do I start? Well, you can start here or here or here or here or here or here. And then they're like, I don't know where to start. I know I should start, but I don't know where to start. And we think we're doing them a favor because we're saying, hey, here's 25 different ways that you could start. All they're looking for is one way.
Mm-hmm.
One way. And this was the crazy thing that I learned from the book was, if your explanation of something or your invitation of something causes people to burn too many calories. So our brain consumes a great number of calories. And you know this on things that you started reading and you passed on because it was just too complicated, because you're burning so many calories that you're just like, I don't get it. And then you move on to the next thing. And it's not your fault for not getting it. It's their fault for not being clear enough in what they were leading you to. So the same thing in the church. We've got small groups on the brain. We don't understand why anybody would resist being in a small group, but it's a matter of, how do we make it clear? What's their resistance? What's their objection? How does being in a small group not fit into their story right now? And how can we bridge that over, other than just making a very colorful Skyrizi commercial for small groups? But how do we bridge that over and show them this would be useful to you and this will help you to achieve your goals?
I think the other thing that you just triggered in my brain too is, we're in the middle, we're about to start groups up in September. But so right now we are trying to recruit more leaders. And so we did an email blast yesterday trying to let people know, like, hey, like, we want you to lead a group. And I think one of the things that we missed in the past is that we would do all the lead a group or start a group. Your phrase is better. Start a group is much easier, less calories than lead a group, right? Because they got to get over that hurdle of, am I a leader? That what I've learned through this, though, is that you end up marketing your groups through this as well, or like letting people know. So like, even though I didn't get maybe as many people as I hoped for that are interested in starting a group, I got a bunch of people who signed up to get notifications when groups open. So it gets them thinking about it. And I think that's another kind of thing that took me like 10 years to learn into this process. But don't underestimate that start a group process and what it can do with people who are just on the sidelines as well.
Yeah. And I think too, what's the perception of a group? What does that feel like? Do I have to know a certain amount? Do I have to be a certain way? Do I have to act together? Are people going to get in my business? Those sorts of things. And I discovered one year we were starting groups and we were going to start with an open house. They were going to start with a Super Bowl party. And so our slogan kind of became, what if your group was more like a Super Bowl party and less like what you're afraid a small group is?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of that thing of, focusing on the relationship, knowing that there's going to be content, knowing that there's going to be, encouragement, there's going to be iron sharpening iron, there's going to be accountability, all of those sorts of things, but it doesn't have to necessarily be a rigid environment. So what is their perception of a group? Because if they're not in a group, then whatever they think a group is doesn't fit into what they're doing. Whereas we're like, come on, groups could be for everybody. Groups will help you. Groups will support you. Or they don't want to get together with a group of strangers. So I'm like, well, or they don't want to get together with a bunch of people. Their house is not big enough, or on and on. It's not our problem to solve. Yeah. But if we give our people permission and opportunity to form a group, like I'm not going to become like the guru for Twitch small groups because I don't think you could do a group on Twitch. I only know about Twitch because of my 16-year-old. But if I give people permission and say, anywhere that you're connecting with people, could you do something, intentional about your spiritual growth? Would they be interested in doing something to follow along with that? Yeah. I don't want to meet with strangers. Well, then meet with your friends. Yeah. I don't have any friends. Well, then, go talk to Pastor Nick. He'll help you find friends. He'll be your friend.
I would also just add in there too, if that idea scares you of having experimental groups and stuff like that, I would encourage you to know that groups don't have to be public. You can, in fact, I almost think those experimental groups are better, and you get better results if they're not public and they have to go and recruit their own people. Because that'll they'll find other people who are passionate about the same things. And you don't want to be on stage pushing all these different ways that people can connect. It's going to confuse people when you do that. Give them one simple thing that they can connect with. And if that's the core of your groups, communicate that. But if you have these fringe groups, don't give them the same airtime. You already talked about this.
Yeah. And the truth is, if our whole church was getting together to encourage each other, to study and apply God's word, and they were doing all of that behind our backs, would that really be a problem?
No.
We wouldn't even call it small groups. You just call it normal. This is what normal believers in the church do. They practice these one another's, and they do some of it in person. They do some of it over their iPhone. And we'll just call it normal. And we don't. So what? You're not the pastor. We don't have small groups anymore. What's your job? Well, I'm the pastor of normal. Why not? But I think this idea of, do we believe in our people enough? Uh-huh. Now, this may not be a fair read, but when I look at Paul's missionary journeys in Acts and how he planted churches, he didn't spend, by my count, any more than 6 to 18 months in any particular city because he was compelled to preach Christ where Christ had never been heard of before. Mm-hmm. So he would go in, he would set up the church, he would spend a little bit of time, 6 to 18 months with them. He'd choose the best and brightest to be their elders. And he'd say, hey, I'm on to the next city, but if you get into a problem, write me a letter. Because that was the technology of the day, right? And that's how we got a lot of the New Testament. 6 to 18 months to start a church. And so you think of the stuff that, we go through of, well, we want quality. We don't just want quantity. We want quality groups. Well, here's a news flash. If you don't have quantity, quality doesn't matter. You've got, and the other thing is that we don't have to wait till somebody gets their master of divinity before we let them lead something. They just have to be a little bit further ahead of somebody else. Yeah. And so here's a classic example. In the spring, we launched groups. I'm serving as the outsourced small group pastor at Mount Hope Church in Lansing, Michigan. So in the spring, we started groups around a series called Together. And we had, I think we grew by about 88% is what we had. Anyway, so then now we're doing another series this fall and we're in the middle of recruiting for that. But the first thing I do before I recruit leaders is I go to the existing leaders and I say, hey, would you walk alongside, would you be the guide in the story of a new host and help them out, answer their questions, encourage them, pray for them, keep them from giving up when they invite 3 friends and 2 of them say no, that sort of thing. So I'm at this meeting at the beginning of this month, and I have all of the current life group leaders. I have all of the hosts there from the Together groups. And I say, if you would be interested, then sign up to be at one of these briefings to meet these new hosts. And lo and behold, a couple of them that signed up had just started leading a group, hosting a group during the spring series. And now they're coaching a brand new leader that's never led a group before because they have 6 weeks more experience at leading a group than the new person who's never led a group before.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not? Because they care enough they're going to pick up the phone and call them. They're going to encourage them. They are going to pray for them, and they are going to help them. And I think sometimes we just, we hold on too long. One of the quotes from the Hero Maker book, they say the practice of permission giving is a shift from seeing what God can do through my own leadership to seeing what God can do through other leaders. Permission giving requires that we learn to lead with a yes and use simple tools like I see in you conversations. Mm-hmm. And so my friend Eddie Mosley at Brentwood Baptist in Brentwood, Tennessee, will walk up to people on Sunday morning and sincerely say to them, have you ever considered being a small group leader? Because I think you would do a great job at that. Yeah. Now, you have to be sincere. It's not like, did you hear what Pastor Nick just said to me? He thinks I would be a great small group leader. It's like, okay, do you know Pastor Nick said that to 100 other people this week? He's just desperate. No, but when we sincerely see that in somebody, or a small group leader sees that in a member of their group, which I know is not popular because we don't like to split up our groups in North America, but to be able to be selfless enough to say, I think you would do a great job at this. And then if we were a guide to the leader who's the hero, the leader is a guide to the members who are the hero. So everybody's just helping everybody else advance at various levels.
So we got 2 left here, which is that helps them avoid failure. So let's talk about this a little bit. What are the problems that we're helping people avoid? Personally, for me, I think it's helping them avoid loneliness, but that's the relation side. But I also think that it's helping them to avoid being spiritually stuck. I think that's another thing that we've seen, and it's interesting. It might lead into that last one of how do we define success. Someone who is spiritually stuck isn't necessarily going to be taking steps of faith. So what are those steps of faith that you're kind of looking at inside of your groups that allow them to know whether they're successful or not?
I think it starts with what people are motivated to do. Yeah. I could say, well, I need to lose weight. I need to better manage my time, and I need to pay attention to the maintenance on my car. But then the one that gets my attention is the one where I go to the doctor and the doctor tells me something I don't want to hear, or my car's making a noise or broke down and I have to call AAA. That's the one that's top of my list, that I have to get my car fixed before I can get my body fixed, before I can get my schedule fixed. So I have a friend of mine in Orlando, John Hampton at Journey Christian Church, and he wanted to work on his body. So he joined a gym, and the gym gave him a personal trainer. And the personal trainer said, okay, John, tell me what you want to work on. And so John told him, and he developed a program based on what John wanted to accomplish. And John had this realization of, why don't we do this in the church? Why don't we ask people what they want to work on? Instead, we treat people like we're manufacturing widgets and they're all going to come out the same. Well, they don't even start the same. And then, and of course, Marcus Buckingham says the problem with people is they're just never done. But, but how is it, again, where a person's motivated, what they're feeling, how could we help them achieve their next step? And maybe that means small groups. Maybe that means some individualized focus. But what I'm saying is it's not a set plan that's true of everybody. But we start out with the things that they're motivated to do. And then from there, then we can get them into the things that, they ought to know, they ought to learn, that sort of thing. But it's easier to help somebody with something they're already motivated to do than it is to create the motivation and then convince them they should do it, and then they do it.
Yeah. So my question for that then is, I think that sounds great, but then how do you prevent that from turning into, oh, you have a problem, we can fix it? So in other words, I find that philosophy for some churches, and maybe ours, is that it turns then, how do you prevent that from turning into programmatic, where oh, you have this issue, we have a program for you. Oh, you have this issue, there's a program for you, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that, we kind of go back to the definition of making a disciple. And, how do you make a disciple? Well, disciples make disciples. So I think sometimes, and especially when you're in larger churches, and I've served larger churches, I served a very small church that became a larger church, that we think that, well, the program is the answer because we can't be personal.
Yeah.
But the truth is we have to be personal. And, we can't be personal with every person in the congregation as a pastor, but we can team people up. And I think just beginning to create the spirit and it can be in groups, but it can also be within ministry areas, and everybody is called to make disciples. That's a great commission. I like this quote from Derwin Gray that's in the Hero Maker book. He says, "The best leaders look into the soul of a person and say, I see what you could be, and my role is to bring that out of you."
Yeah.
So maybe we put people in, what's an environment that's going to help them to grow? Who's somebody that has a margin of victory that's a little further down the road than the person that's currently dealing with that? So, it's not cookie cutter for sure. But then how do you individualize all of that? Well, you don't. I don't. We get that down to small group leaders, and having small group leaders help people to determine, what are their spiritual next steps. And maybe their next step is a study. Maybe their next step is a book. Maybe it's a class. Maybe it's an experience. Maybe it's serving in some capacity. To begin to think about things in terms of that. But I think the main thing is staff members need to stop doing. I jokingly say, but there's truth to it, is that ministry is not something that we do to people. So any staff member, any person on our staff, any person that we hire should be multiplying themselves and should be developing people to take on other roles, and then to begin to create that culture. Because then, who's the next small group leader? Who's the next coach? Who's the next small group pastor? Who's the next church planter? I mean, all of these people are within your church, but how are we encouraging that in people? How are we helping people see that? And a lot of times people have very natural giftings that they don't see themselves, and you have to call it out of them and say, you're very good at encouraging people. You're very insightful in these things. Instead of just assuming that, they know that they're gifted in that. They don't necessarily know that.
What I find with the giftings is that they're not able to see their own strengths because they assume that everyone else has that. It comes naturally to them as well.
Exactly.
So they think that everyone can just do that as natural as they can. And so it really helps to just be like, hey, you're really good at helping people belong when new people show up to group. I really thank you for doing that when it comes to group. I think that's why it comes back to Dave Ferguson's I see in you conversations that they have. Hey, this is what I see in you. This is what I would love for you to be able to step into. So.
Yeah. And even, going back into my other love, which is ministry discovery, and looking at, whether it's Shape or Network or, GPS that Brian Phipps and Rob Wegner have out now. But helping people see, how are they shaped for ministry? And, answering big questions like, if you knew you couldn't fail, what would you attempt to do for God? I mean, our church in California, we got to the point where we disciplined ourselves not to start any new ministry until we had somebody coming out of the Shape process that was gifted and called to do that ministry. Those were the only ministries we began to do in our church.
Gosh, what a great principle that is.
Listening to, instead of trying to, fill holes, but we started a lot of other great things. Just because we had those conversations with people of what they felt gifted and called to do, and putting them in that role. And then in all of those roles, making disciples along the way. So I think that, again, the whole thing of reading these books is going back and saying the person in the pew, what are they dealing with? Not assuming, having actual conversations with actual people. Yeah. What are they dealing with? What are they open to? What are they motivated to do? And then how can we assist them in some way? And maybe we can't. Maybe we refer to them to somebody else that can assist in a particular area. But how can we what are they open to do?
Yeah. So awesome. These are two great books. They're really quick reads. So I really encourage you to pick them up. I know the Storybrand one, even just the audiobook of it alone is 4 hours. And so you 2x that, you're done in 2 hours. So 2 sittings, you're done with it. It's fantastic. Cool. So, hey, let's dive into the lightning round. What's another book you've read recently or currently reading that's had an impact on your leadership?
Well, I'm halfway through the biography of George Washington by Ron Chernow. And being halfway through, I'm seriously doubting that the colonists are going to win this thing.
Yeah.
because it's looking bad.
Yeah.
But, the French are helping out now. But holy cow, what they went through. I don't know how that applies to small groups. I read a wide variety of stuff.
Cool. I love biographies too. I try to read at least one a year. But the last one I did was on Jim Henson, which was fantastic. And kind of the struggles that he personally went through. I also love the thick biographies that cover everything. Like, I don't want the revised, cleaned up, polished ones. Like, give me the dirt, give me the struggles. I can learn from those. So cool. Alan, this was great. I was so glad I was able to squeeze you in. I know you've just moved and ramping up towards September here. So I'm just glad you could be on. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. So,
hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I'm Nick Lenzi, and I want to thank you for listening with us. Thanks to Alan for being bold and sharing 2 books with us. We hope that you enjoyed today's podcast.